Class. So here we are. I'm going to, you've probably already heard the introduction, and we're going to just jump right into this interview with Professor Hsiao here. So, what initially drew you into the study of philosophy, both formally and possibly informally? It seems that before you had already made note that you had pretty much made a habit, or at least at one place at one point in time, had gotten into an argument on the internet, like the type of game that you can participate with other individuals with at 12 years old, and you feel
hmm
like you got your tail handed to you, and you feel like you
Yeah,
needed to go somewhere with that.
yeah. No, it goes back all the way to when I was 12. I was playing this internet video game, and I went on the discussion boards. There was a discussion about religion and the existence of God. I was eager, and I jumped in, and I got my butt handed to me. And so I decided from that moment that that was not going to happen again, and that I was going to start reading about, and studying, matters pertaining to the faith, why I believe it, what it is that I believe. And so that's what really started me on apologetics. I read Lee Strobel, Josh McDowell, the beginner stuff, and then as I grew older through high school, I moved my way up to Norman Geisler, J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig, and by my senior year, I was reading dense analytic philosophy along the lines of Alvin Plantinga, Robert Adams, and those kinds of individuals. And so that by that time I'd made up my mind that when I was going to go to college that I was going to study philosophy. And so I came into college already having read quite a bit of philosophy, and so I breezed through my classes quite easily. And it was around that time, senior year of high school, first year of college, that I was introduced to the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. I read it was originally through Norman Geisler, and then I read a bunch of Ed Feser. And in college, I decided to specialize in an area of philosophy, and it was ethics. And so, in college, my interests narrowed more specifically to two areas, mainly ethics, but also some philosophy of religion. And so, I basically did some intensive studying on natural law theory and broadly Thomistic philosophy in general, and that's basically what shaped the further direction of my intellectual development in college. It's what led me to write the papers that I have out right now, and so it all goes back to just that debate I had when I was 12 years old. It led me to study apologetics, which led me to study some New Testament stuff and history of theology, and then eventually to philosophy as the foundation for all of that. And it's been an interesting experience after that.
Awesome. And it seems that there's a common thread for many that get into philosophy that are theists. It seems that there's a not always the same, but it seems like there's a common pattern that either objections from the external, from another agent, or just internally, that they're struggling with some sort of questions as they pertain to God uh, that are philosophical in nature. They're not necessarily historical reliability of the New Testament, though those things are interesting.
Mhm.
It seems that those that have been drawn to philosophy that are theists have had themselves either challenged with philosophical types of objections, or they themselves have struggled with philosophical types of objections in regards to theism. Now, I thought that it was interesting that when you said that you were early, right, very early, uh, uh, say academic career in high school, that you were reading the likes of William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga and J.P. Moreland. But when you were going through that particular part of your discourse there, I was interested. How did you know to go that way? I mean, did you have someone over and above you that thought, oh yeah, well he needs to read J.P. Moreland or William Lane Craig? I know that when I was in high school, I was watching, Conan the Destroyer. I mean, that was as far as my intellectual aptitude was going at that point. So, what kind of resources, or who was the person that knew to direct you in that way? How did you get onto those types of individuals at that young of an age?
Yeah, so that was around 2008, 2009, 2010, and I really didn't have anybody over me. I had a few teachers. I went to a Christian school. I had a few teachers who were
Okay.
supportive of what I was doing, but they didn't really give me any point. It was just me. I would read a book, and then I would track down the references in that book, and I'd be like, well, that's an interesting source. Why don't I read that book? And so I just basically reference hopped from book to book, and I got a broad understanding of just the general area of apologetics at that time. And I also, at the time, I ran a little apologetics forum, a blog for young apologists. And so I would always be researching, always be reading other stuff on the internet, and it would lead me to this source and that source. And I would just keep reading. And I was pretty well read by the time I left high school. I could tell you, all the major apologetics books and, the main thesis found in them. And I can name all the major apologists and philosophers currently working. And so it was really just a self-study. I guess in high school, I was never the kind of person to watch TV all that often. I did play video games, but I really liked to read. And so every spare moment I had, I was always in some kind of book. I don't do this anymore. I guess it's past my golden years, but there were times where I could read an entire apologetics book in 2 days.
I was about to say, yeah. Well, maybe you're not past your golden years yet. I mean, you're 26, so there you go in that. But yeah, that is pretty awesome.
I remember reading Tim Keller's "The Reason for God." I had gone to another city for a high school competition. And while I decided to go to one of the bookstores, so I picked up Tim Keller's "The Reason for God," and on the way back from that trip, I read the entire book.
Yeah. Now that is a very friendly book to read. It's kind of an easy read in the sense that it's almost enjoyable. You're not having to stop page per page and think about some deep sort of analytical problem. Like, now, what is this actually? Let me go through this again. Mm-hmm. It's almost an enjoyable type of read. So it's still astounding that at that age that you're running through books like that. But that is in and of itself a really nice. Now, to say something funny, I'm an apologetics junkie myself. And that kind of led me into philosophy as an academic pursuit. But it's funny you mentioned Reason for God. I didn't even read Reason for God until 2 or 3 years after I'd already graduated with my all of those sorts of things. And so it was kind of like, how did I just miss this one for so long? But anyway, let's just continue on here. I really like that. That was interesting. And also, the next question, is also interesting too, how you said you would just kind of reference hop, because that's something else that I've picked up in that's common in some of these pursuits. In fact, that was in regard even to my own. Like you said, I believe I was reading Ravi Zacharias or whoever, and then I would see him quote this guy named Chesterton, right? Well, then I would go read Chesterton's books, and then Ravi later would quote somebody like Geisler, then I'd go read Geisler stuff, and so there's this common thread between a lot of those that we've initially talked of here. Now, one of the perennial questions, right? One of the big questions that's constantly tossed about within the philosophy of religion and just even philosophy, just as a discipline as a whole. If you're an undergrad and you're taking an intro to philosophy course, you've probably heard something about this topic. And if you're literally composing a PhD of some sort in philosophy of religion, then you're dealing with this topic. And that is the question of faith and reason. Well, that is not itself is not a question, right? But the question would be, what is the relation between faith and reason? Now, obviously, philosophers of different stripes are going to try to answer that differently. But how would you, Professor Hsaio, how would you answer that question? What is your stance in regards to the perennial question of how does faith relate to reason and vice versa?
Yeah. So despite my parents aren't Christian, and very few people in my family are Christian, but they sent me to a Christian school, and all of my friends and much of my Bible education in that school, when we learned about faith, it was always, we learned about faith as if it were some kind of basically blind faith, not, it was just, hoping desperately that something is true, or just really just placing placing a bet on something without a good reason. And so I was always, the stock answer when the student asked a teacher and the teacher didn't know was, well, you just need to have faith.
Right. Fideism of some sort.
Yeah.
Right.
And I didn't fully grasp the distinction between faith and reason until I really started looking into, well, okay, what does the Bible say about faith? How is faith used in, for example, Hebrews? And I always thought that before I studied this topic, that faith and reason were at odds with each other. As the Mark Twain quote goes, faith is that which I believe isn't so.
Right. But faith is believing what you know ain't so. That's right.
Yeah. And I became, and that I learned wasn't what the Bible actually taught about faith. Faith is more like trusting in something that you have good reasons or good evidence for regarding as valid, trustworthy, or otherwise reliable. And so I see the role of philosophy, apologetics, history, science, all these disciplines as supporting faith. Not so much that they're substitutes for faith, but they are what they're what ground your faith. Or they're what provide an anchor to your faith. So faith isn't just blind reaching out in darkness, hoping that you'll grasp onto something. It's doing so with the assurance that you will find what you're looking for, that you will that there is a solid foundation out there. Now, there is a trust element to faith, but that trust is based on good reasons. And so when somebody says have faith, and they mean it to be, well, just blindly hope that something will happen, that is not actually what biblical faith is. Biblical faith is faith that's grounded in trust. It's grounded in good reasons. It's what Hebrews says. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. There is an evidential component to faith. It doesn't exhaust faith, but it certainly plays a role in supplementing your faith.
Right. So traditionally, there's a couple different views of faith over reason, reason over faith, faith only, reason only. And then there's it sounds to me that essentially what you're saying is that you would agree with the notion set forth by someone like Aquinas, that it's not faith over reason, reason over faith, reason only or faith only, but faith and reason in a complementary fashion there. I think JP2 said something to the effect of essentially that faith and reason were two wings on the opposite sides of a bird, right? That's the only way that the bird as a whole can fly, right? Not to confuse that with silly little political, parallels and analogies about the left wing and the right wing and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, I grew up among some, and I don't mean to use this term pejoratively, but many people I knew were fundamentalist in that,
Sure.
The ultimate authority, or that the only thing we should trust is the Bible, and everything outside the Bible is unreliable. And I understand and I respect their reverence for the Bible. I do think that, the Bible is the divinely inspired word of God, inerrant in the original manuscripts. But I don't think it's accurate to say that it's not in the Bible, then, you can't trust it, or that, the Bible is the only source of truth. Because even the way we interpret the Bible, right? We rely on interpretive principles that are not found in the Bible. Right. So the Bible, and in the Bible itself says, there can be truths found outside of special revelation. Paul himself quoted Greek philosophers when he was reasoning with them. And so it's not as if the Bible has a monopoly on truth. The Bible might be an authority, but it doesn't mean it has, all truth must be in the Bible. Otherwise, it's not acceptable.
Right, and plus too, if for no other reason, it's just patently self-defeating to say that there's no truths outside of the Bible, and things of that nature. which some of you students may be familiar with if we've already discussed those topics in class or maybe another course that we were discussing here.
Mhm.
Now, just real quickly, Professor, as a side note, I was just interested to hear that you said that at 12 years old you had already converted to Christ. You converted to Christian theism, if we want to put it academically, or just basically you'd become a Christian. But you were also not in the home of Christian. You weren't raised a Christian, nor I grew up in a home that was not Christian either. Um, but quickly, just so the students may perhaps they can look at this some other time. But do you have any sort of a link to where something like your conversion, your testimony, may be available for them to listen to that aspect of your journey if they wanted to do that later at some point?
I haven't written that up, but I probably should.
Yeah,
My background's sort of interesting. My parents weren't Christian, but
right.
they sent me to a Christian school because they wanted me to have a good education. And I did get a very good education in the Christian school. I also got more than just the education.
Right. You also got Jesus.
Yeah, I'm very thankful for that they did it. So
sure. Yeah, you need to do that because I'm sure that other students may be very interested, Christian or not, to hear your spiritual journey there. Into philosophy and apologetics and all these sorts of things, and yet your parents were neither Christian, at the time. Now, so yeah, if you find that, I'll put the link up in maybe the syllabus or a link under the lecture or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Now, back to our questions here. In your opinion, and of course, it's we hate to use that word, but sometimes it's legitimate, right? In your opinion, what is the greatest outside threat to Christian faith in the modern era? In fact, I would say it this way. In your opinion, what is the greatest outside threat to Christian faith in the modern era? But then also, after that, what is the greatest internal threat, would you say? But first, let's do the external. What do you think is the greatest external threat to something like the Christian faith in our era, in our day and age?
Yeah, so it's a complex question, so I would divide it into maybe a few parcels. Within the United States, I would say.
Or Western culture, maybe?
Yeah. Well, let's just talk about the United States.
Okay.
Europe, in Europe, it's sort of something else, I would say. But so in the United States right now, the greatest challenge to Christianity right now would be something like secularism, relativism, or basically the so let me put it this way. If you tell somebody you're a Christian today, it's not going to. Some people might, push back at you, but you're not really going to get that much pushback because one of the norms of Western society that you just do not transgress is tolerance, right? And so you tell somebody you're a Christian, they'll probably say, "Oh, that's very good. You should practice your religion, and they'll add stipulations like, the privacy, of whatever."
Right.
You do.
Right.
Now,
in your bathroom or whatever.
Now, if I say that I'm a Christian and I believe that marriage is between one man and one woman, oh well, now
right.
that is not acceptable. So the main challenge to Christianity, I would say, comes in these social areas or these moral issues where traditional Christian doctrines are under attack. Because they transgress some idea of, we all need to be equal, or we should be tolerant, or we should accept what people do with their own bodies, that kind of stuff. So it's not so much it's not so much Christianity that's under assault per se. It's certain Christian doctrines. But insofar as those Christian doctrines are under attack, Christianity is under attack.
Sure.
By these liberal, libertarian, individualistic, pluralistic ways of thinking.
Right.
Now, if you ask me what's the greatest threat to Christianity elsewhere in the world, I would say hands down Islam, especially in Europe, where you see Islamization of the culture happening very, very quickly. And so the challenge there isn't so much and I mean, there is a challenge from these attitudes I've just described, but there's also a competing system known as Islam that is not at all compatible with Christianity and that seeks to actively repress Christians in many places of the world. So if you wanted me to narrow it down to the United States, I'd say secularism in general. Europe, Asia, Africa, I would say Islam. So
Right.
that's how I'd break up my answer to your question.
All right. So it seems that we could even, if we were going to try to be, make it some sort of bland, reductionistic response, it seems that we could at least say that in some sense it's, but they're both of those are it's ideological in some sense, and so that we can see the once again the consequences of ideas, right? That trite little sayings like it's not necessarily important what you believe, what's important is what you do. But here, again, just in regards to what you deem to be two major threats to, say, Christian theism, are based off particular ideas, particular ideologies that have worked themselves out down into the culture, whether they be religious ideologies or whether they be secularistic, or if that's even a word, right? Secular types of ideologies. Fair enough to say in regards to that.
Yeah, and you also asked about internal
Right.
divisions in within Christianity. And I would say, owing to what I described as the main challenge to Christianity in the United States, it would be something like liberal theology or theology that seeks to undermine or water down certain Christian doctrines. So, for example, revisionist teachings on sexuality and the family, revisionist teachings on salvation and the church, denial, for example, of the traditional doctrine of hell. And so the main challenge within Christianity would be theological liberalism. You don't really see much of that in, say, Asia or Africa, but you do see a lot of it in Europe especially, and then in the United States as well. And those divisions cause literal divisions within denominations, and they cause all sorts of conflict, and they just tear up the church from within. And so not having sound doctrine is what I would say is a major internal threat to Christianity.
So would you say that it's safe to say that secularism and some sort of atheistic form of humanism and all those sorts of things, would you say that though that is the greatest external threat to, say, Christianity in the United States, do you think that it could be argued that that's really possibly also the greatest internal threat, in the sense that it's those ideologies that have also led to loose theological positions or liberal theological positions? So,
yeah, I mean, a lot of the, take for example the whole movement to redefine sexuality and the family within some mainline Protestant denominations.
right.
A lot of that, I mean, first, a lot of that just owes to rationalization of bad behavior. And another part of that traces basically back to the sexual revolution and all the. I mean, you look at, for example, the idea that theologians who argue that, well, the Bible actually doesn't condemn homosexuality. The Bible actually teaches that homosexual relationships are acceptable. You trace those ideas back. When did they originate? Well, around the same time as the sexual revolution. It's no coincidence that it happened around that time, and that for the past 2,000 years of church history, nobody defended these views. It was only until relatively recently that these ideas bled in the mainstream culture, bled over to Christian doctrine.
Right. So essentially, the point is simply that, yes, we've got theological liberalism that has infected the churches, but it was the culture that led to the theologically liberal positions to begin with, right? And I'm sure there's more nuance to that. So, for instance, we may even have a student taking this particular course that this may be their specialty, some sort of they may not obviously be majoring in these philosophical pursuits, but they may even have more to say there in the theological aspects, what's going on. So obviously, students, if you do, then feel free throw that into your discussion posts or any of your essay papers, any of those sorts of things that you want to do. But I tend to think that that's most likely the case as well with Dr. Hsaio here, that the greatest external threat, and in one sense, the greatest internal threat is, again, just culture, secularism, humanism, those types of ideas that have infiltrated the church in some sense. Now, let's get into some of the specialty of not yet, but soon to be Dr. Hsaio here. And just as we've looked at with some of our others that we've discussed on here, their nuanced position in philosophy. Professor Hsaio also has his nuanced position too, and that's just the nature of the discipline. So our professor here today, for the most part, leans, if not just completely identifies, at least strongly leans towards the Thomistic position in philosophy, at least in some pretty standout areas here. And of course, as you guys know from the course, I'm like, yay, hip hip hooray! I lean that way too. So, how would you, Professor Hsaio, how would you explain natural law theory or natural? Let's just go and combine them for sake of just for ease here. Natural law and virtue theory. How might you explain that to the intelligent layman who is not necessarily schooled in philosophy, but he can read a book or two? How might you explain that to the intelligent layman? Natural law theory and virtue theory.
So if I had to give the 10-second elevator pitch of natural law in one sentence, I would say morality is about, on natural law theory, morality is about fulfilling your function. That really captures what natural law theory is. A natural law theory starts with the observation that things have purposes. Your eyes are for seeing, your lungs are for breathing, and not just, my own body, but you look out in the world, there are purposes all over the place. There's purposeful systems in nature, in plants and animals, in the way natural regularities work, in the laws of nature, in how chemical and biological substances behave. And so natural law theory takes this observation that things have purposes and applies it to morality. So take, for example, and I always like to use analogies to illustrate natural law theory. So take, for example, a pen, right? Ask yourself, well, what is the function of a pen? Well, obviously the function of a pen is to write. Now, what is a good pen? What does it mean for a pen to be good? Well, obviously a pen is good if it does what a pen should do, which is write well. So something is good by functioning as it should. Take for example, an orange tree. Right? What is an orange tree supposed to do? Well, it's supposed to produce fruit. It's supposed to grow in certain ways. It's supposed to mature according to its powers, capacities, and dispositions. So what is a good orange tree? Well, a good orange tree is one that develops and bears fruit in the way that's supposed to. By contrast, if I take an orange tree, put it in my basement and water it with Coke, well, what's going to happen to it? It's going to die because it's not a good orange tree. It's not fulfilling its function well. It's a bad instance of its kind. So that general observation of goodness and badness, how it depends on something's function, applied to morality, that goodness and badness takes on a moral dimension insofar as human beings are capable of reasoning. I am able to understand what's good for me. I can choose what's good for me. And morality, at the most basic level, whether you're a utilitarian, a deontologist, or a natural law theory, all moral theories agree that morality is about pursuing what is good and avoiding what's evil. Now, obviously, they'll disagree on, what is good and what is evil, but everyone would agree that you should pursue the good and you should avoid what's evil. Now, on natural law theory, as I've just argued, goodness is defined in terms of proper functioning. And so on natural law theory, the moral thing to do would be to pursue what's good for you and to avoid what's bad for you. Well, okay, what's good for me? Well, what's good for me is what corresponds to the fulfillment of my functions, my capacities, my natural dispositions. So something like, a healthy diet and exercise is good for me because it promotes the functioning of my body. Something like smoking or sitting on my couch all day eating cheese puffs. That is not good for me because it leads to an unhealthy life. And so natural law theory is just taking that general observation about goodness and badness and applying it to the way we behave and in the things we pursue and the things we avoid. So it's really at its core a common sense understanding of it's based on common sense intuitions about what we understand as being good or bad. And you
That's
look at something like, the medical profession. A doctor operates based on this implicit idea that things have purposes and that if something is not functioning the way it should, well, the good thing to do would be to correct it, would be to bring it back to its proper function. So this idea of natural law, this idea of proper function is presupposed by the medical sciences. If we didn't have any purposes, or if our body parts weren't meant for something, then the medical sciences would be inexplicable. So this is natural law theory really is just a bringing together of intuitions about goodness, badness, functions, and capacities that we have, that we readily observe and that we readily accept for all areas of our life.
That's right. And so I think when you say it's based on a common sense intuition or common sense intuitions in regards to how things function, I think that one of the most, and you can tell me what you think here in regard to this, I think that one of the most interesting aspects about natural law theory as it pertains to morality, obviously, is the fact that though it is heavily contingent upon the the metaphysical underpinning that undergirds that, right, based on natures and essences and so on and so forth, is that even if you don't know anything about natures and essences and abstracting natures and essences and deriving their purpose from a thing's formal cause as found within its particular nature and all those sorts of things, I think one of the some of the explanatory power in natural law theory is that you don't have to know any of those things, but that you're doing those things if the theory itself is correct. So that if natural law theory is true, then let's say it this way, the epistemology behind it, you don't even necessarily need to know because you're already doing it already. Like people are already abstracting nature's essences, finding the thing's purpose in its formal cause. And they don't even have to know that they're doing such
We're
things.
literally doing what comes naturally to us.
Exactly. And so that's one of the ways that I would explain to my students, at least one of the super positives of natural law theory is that, hey guys, look, if this is working, you're already doing it anyway, right? As opposed to almost any other ethical theory. Let's take, for instance, Kant's deontology, right? How many farmers, like my granddad, who grew up literally, I'm not speaking figuratively here, who literally grew up here in the deep South in Georgia picking cotton, right? I mean, that's what he did. Now, how often, when he made moral decisions, did he go through the categorical imperative to see if he was delving into some sort of thing that would contradict and create a contradiction if applied universally? But if natural law theory is true, right, most of his moral decisions he was doing naturally, though he had a seventh grade education and he's picking cotton, right? So I think that's one of the positives of that particular theory. Agree or disagree?
Yeah, Aristotle writes that every agent, I think it was Aristotle, sometimes I confuse what Aristotle says with what Aquinas says, but Aristotle says every agent tends toward an end. And we see that obviously in human beings, but just look at the animal world, look at the plant world, the way an animal behaves, for example. Animals do what they do. Right. They perform by nature or instinctually self-perfective behaviors. They seek out shelter, they make a nest, they seek out food, they reproduce. And look at plants too. They develop in a law-like way in accordance with what's good for them. They naturally pursue or they seek out in a obviously they don't intentionally seek it like we do, but they do tend towards the good. And so and this is what I think is one of the virtues of natural law, as what you say. There is already this inclination to pursue what's good for us, and we can recognize just by an act of intuition what is good for us. I mean, if you present me with a salad on one side and a pile of dog poop on the other, I'm not going to have difficulty deciding, what's good for me to eat.
Right.
Obviously it's the salad, not the dog poop. So we already have a natural inclination to know what is good for us and that we should pursue it. Natural law theory really just builds on that uh, hard wiring that we have in us. I mean, we're rational beings, right? We operate rationally, and part of reason involves discerning, the convertibility of the transcendentals. Goodness is
Right.
convertible with truth, which is convertible with being, and so we naturally tend towards, as rational beings, pursuing what's true and what's good and what's fulfilling of us. That's the function of rationality.
Right. And so even if the individual, say one of the students watching that says, well, yeah, but there are some people that would choose the dog poo over the salad. Well, again, the power of natural law theory is like, sure, they may do that. But if natural law theory is true, then there's going to be ramifications for choosing the poo over the salad. Meaning that even if you quote unquote decide to eat that, it will still self retard the function
Mm-hmm.
for which your body is just made to perform at. Meaning you can eat that and you'll die
Mm-hmm.
because your particular belief about eating that doesn't make it the case that you will be able to function
Mm-hmm.
or that your digestive system will be able to reach that particular end, because it's just not
Mm-hmm.
the end of the digestive system to ingest and digest, I should say, rather, poo.
And
Now, go ahead.
consequences do teach us about morality, because I
Sure.
don't think anybody enjoys throwing up all night, or I don't think anybody
Right.
enjoys living in agony from making poor life choices. So consequences can get us to orient ourselves towards what's actually true and proper for us. If I consume a ton of alcohol, I spend the entire next day hungover, well, that's gonna signal to me, well, that probably isn't good for my body, and that I probably
Right.
shouldn't do that kind of thing.
Right. Even if you continue to do it, your body will continue to revolt based on the function and
Mm-hmm.
purpose and end goal of your body.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, that's just one of those red flags. Even if you continue to do it, your body's saying that's not the purpose, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
not the end goal. Now, how would you tack on very quickly there? I want to, just to save time, I was going to say, how would you bridge the is-alt distinction there that someone like David Hume tries to bring up that says, well, just because your eye can see, the is-alt distinction. I'm sure that the students are familiar with that in some sense. And then maybe later we can address the issue of some would charge, well, that we're equivocating, right? That we say, well, this is good for the pen, or that's good for the knife, or that's good for the, whatever other particular example we have. But then we're equivocating when we try to shuffle that over into moral goodness. So I'm glad you kind of touched on the transcendentals right there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can go into that later in a separate thing. But having said that, how would you tack on virtue theory at the end of natural law theory? Would you say that they're really a continuation of the same ethical theory, or would you say that they're distinct? How would you go with that?
Yeah, so some people like to treat virtue theory as if it were its own moral theory, separate from natural law.
By the way, I don't think that works.
Yeah, I don't think that works either. So the way I see it is that a virtue is a disposition towards what is right. Now, what is right? Well, natural law theory provides the answer. Something is good if it promotes my flourishing, something's bad if it doesn't. So a virtue is a disposition towards an activity that promotes your flourishing. Without natural law theory, all you have are dispositions, and you can't really judge between good and bad dispositions.
Right. So freeze right there for just a second.
Sure.
Let me toss this in, see if this is where you're going as well. So for instance, one of the typical standard objections to virtue theory is that in order for Aristotle to be a good man, he has to know what good is. But in order to know what good is, he has to, so it's supposed to be circular, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you include natural law theory with that, then you don't run into that particular objection, because he's abstracting based on the nature and the function, the purpose of something, what is good and whatnot.
Yeah, so some virtue theorists like to focus on moral exemplars and say a virtuous person is somebody who approximates or who replicates or who resembles the character of the exemplar. Now, it's stipulated that the exemplar is a virtuous person, but what makes that person a virtuous person?
Right.
the virtue theory by it, just focusing on the virtues doesn't give you that answer. You have to supplement it with an account of, well, okay, why is that person virtuous?
Right.
And
Right.
and without that, I mean, so a virtue is just at its core a good disposition, compared to a vice, which is a bad disposition.
Mhm.
Now, if all you have in your moral theory are just dispositions, there's really no way to distinguish between a good disposition and a bad disposition. You need something other than dispositions that provides a measuring stick for, okay, how do I know this is a good disposition? How do I know that's a bad disposition? And that's where natural law theory comes in. So I think virtue theory is incomplete without natural law. Virtue theory, what virtue theory has to offer to natural law is that virtue theory tells us about our it's a moral theory about our character. It's a moral theory about how to create tendencies that make it easier for you to do what's right. And
Right.
Natural law theory provides the framework. Virtue theory really makes it a matter of, I guess you could say, applying it or internalizing what's good for you, so that you have a disposition or an inclination to do what the natural law prescribes for you.
Right. I would say it's something like this. Like it's something like it's something almost like a practical application of how to best orient yourself to where you're fulfilling the end goal or end purpose of what you were supposed to be originally.
Yeah, I would basically equate it to moral training. Right?
Right.
You have
Right.
on the one hand, natural law theory tells you, okay, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. Virtue theory is the way of it describes, the tendency of a person to habitualize those.
Right. Right. Otherwise, I see virtue theory as to speak metaphorically, as just being suspended in midair. Without natural law theory under it, it's just kind of hanging there. Again, and then that's when I think that most of the traditional objections against virtue theory would work. Well, if Aristotle is supposed to look at a good guy, right, in order to be good, well, then he already has to know what good is. Why does he need to look at the good guy to begin with? And if he doesn't know what good is, then how does he know which one to look at as the good guy? Well, I think that objection is perfectly legitimate if you just have virtue theory by itself sitting there. But if you have natural law, well, then it gives you some sort of grounding up under it, some sort of metaphysical underpinning to get out of those types of objections. This last question here, let's see, let me pull it back up. I went to fade out. Okay, so this last question here, and this is really what I'm interested in hearing you answer here, especially as one that also leans, Thomist in some regard, and that is as one. Now it's just like I'm just repeating myself. As one that leans towards Thomism, Professor Hsaio, what might you say are problems with other popular and or current Christian epistemological positions?
Yeah, so there's quite a few, and for some of them, I wouldn't really say they're problematic. I would say they're incomplete. But there are some that I think are definitely problematic, like presuppositionalism.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. I knew you were going to say that.
On a side note, Scott Olfman recently wrote a book on Aquinas
Right.
as a presuppositionalist, I believe. He was trying to critique the whole Thomistic system. It's a nightmare.
Right.
It is terrible.
I had to do something in regards to a class with the same with the same guy there.
Mm-hmm. But so takes and I'll come back to presuppositionalism, but take something like so when it comes to popular evangelical apologetics, something I notice about that is it takes bits and pieces from Thomism, incorporates it into the system, but rejects the system as a whole. Now, I've got various reasons for why this is the case, but I don't think you can have a coherent philosophy of nature without bringing in, essences or teleology into it. And insofar as people, so there is a dispute within even the Thomistic camp as to is intelligent design something that Thomists
Right.
should
Right.
endorse?
Right.
And without speaking to that issue, I would say that at the forefront of your philosophy of nature should be teleology and essentialism. And if you try to minimize that, you'll end up with a very mechanistic system
Right.
that
Right.
is just not. I mean, I know some apologists who like the mechanistic system and try to do apologetics based on the mechanistic system. I just think the Thomistic system is explanatorily superior to the mechanistic system.
Well, you end up with like something like a deistic conception of
Yeah.
God, in my view, that if you embrace like the mechanistic type deal.
Mm-hmm. And there's a tendency. It's less pronounced now than it was some time ago, but I've noticed that some evangelicals really don't like, and this is you'll see this in the presuppositionalist camp. They really don't like natural revelation. They don't
Right.
like general revelation. They don't like appealing to science or philosophy or history. They want to argue straight from the Bible.
Right.
The Bible says, or everything must presuppose the Bible.
Right.
And as a dialectical move, I think that's just a bad idea, because you try this approach with somebody who doesn't already accept the Bible,
Right.
and you're just going to spend a lot of time just trying to argue over just silly things that I think could just be avoided if you take the classical approach and say,
Right.
look, there are signs in nature, and we can use those signs in nature to show that there is a God, and you don't have to start immediately by presupposing the Bible and then arguing, well, here's why you should accept the Bible, yada yada yada, that kind of thing. So I respect my presuppositionalist brothers, but there are philosophical. I think the whole thing is just like circular, but
Right.
I don't think it's the best strategy for winning over somebody. Not that I don't think people haven't been won over by just a straightforward appeal to the Bible, but it makes things a lot more difficult.
Right. And because in my view, and I'm sure we've got a couple presuppositionalists even in the course, and intelligent guys. There's no doubt about that. But in my view, and this is just my own personal view, even though I happen to be the instructor, right? But my own personal view is just simply that it's not even so much as an apologetic, as it just is. I'm not saying this pejoratively. Um, I don't see it so much as an apologetic as really just as much as a failed epistemology. I think it's just a failed epistemological project. Of course, students and whatnot, you're free to disagree there. Now, what would you say, Tim, in regards to not necessarily related, but not totally distinct? What would you say? What would your thoughts be in regards to something like reformed epistemology, which seems to be something of a popular notion among especially apologists and whatnot?
Yeah. So Plantinga argues that. So he has the
Right.
Aquinas Calvin model, and he argues that traces of it can be found in Aquinas and Calvin and others. And so my, I mean, so belief in God is properly basic. I guess I'm open to it, but I mean, epistemology isn't my area of expertise, and I guess if somebody makes a strong argument for that, and okay, fine, I'm on board with it. But my inclination is that
Okay.
I would not try to. So if somebody asks me, why do you believe in God, and I tell them, well, my belief in God's properly basic.
Right.
Well, okay,
Yeah.
I would prefer appealing to reasons, right? Because it makes it sound more defensible, whereas proper basicality is something that it's kind of private, right? It's not, if I say, well, you should believe in God because it's properly basic, and they say, well, it's not properly basic to me. Well, okay, well,
Right.
so
So one of the critiques that like Dr. McGrew and I would go back and forth on is, in my view, it's just a bit subjective, right?
yeah,
Who's to say what is or isn't properly basic, especially depending on the culture and the context from which you live and from which you glean all of your understanding, right? It seems to be just a more than a bit subjective. In fact, I'll say this after the lecture here. I'll toss something out to you. But is that somewhere where you were going with that, at least in
yeah.
one sense?
I think if you or appealing to something like proper basicality as a reason why you believe in God. Maybe you've had some kind of just maybe you do have a strong intuition that there is a God. Okay, maybe that is sufficient for epistemically justifying your belief in God. But if I were to use it as an apologetic tool, you run into these subjectivity problems. I just don't think that a reformed epistemology, and to my you know to my knowledge, I haven't really seen it used as an apologetic tool. The way I've seen it deployed is basically as a justification for why it's rational for somebody to believe in God without evidence. And I think, okay, yeah, I mean that's fine. But if you try to use it as an apologetic tool, saying, well, you should believe in God because it's properly basic or because it's obvious, that's not going to work.
Right. Well, and one substantial problem that I would have again personally is just simply the fact that I don't. I know this phrase kind of gets tossed about a bit in philosophy, but I really do mean this. I don't know what it means to say that I have just a properly basic belief in God, meaning that I don't know what it means to say that I don't believe in God for some reason, right? I mean, it seems as per Romans chapter 1 that we look at nature, right? We look at the things around us, and in some sense, I'm not saying that children are going about with nuanced, shining, deductive syllogisms in their mind, but in some sense, they're looking at things around them and they're reasoning back to some sort of something because of that. However deep or however shallow that reasoning process may be, I think it's there. One, again, because I'm committed to something like the Thomistic understanding of how our brain works logically, right? That we're constantly running around creating deductive syllogisms of some sort. They're not at the forefront of our noetic structure all the time, right? But that's how we're just hardwired, just as we're hardwired to abstract and whatnot, nature's essences. We're also thinking. It's why we take a bath after we play in the dirt, right? As opposed to vice versa. And so, in regards to belief in God, I don't know. I'm just not sure that I even know what it means to say that there's not really reasons, as opposed to just some self-evident, or properly basic belief, I should say, as to why we do or don't believe in God. Anything you wanted to add in that, or are you ready for the last type of question?
Yeah, I mean, the response that they would offer is, well, we have moral beliefs, and those moral beliefs don't seem to be inferentially just. So they would distinguish between inferentially justified and non-inferentially justified beliefs.
Sure they would.
I am open to somebody, having a non-inferentially justified belief in God. Maybe there is a sensus divinatus. But me personally, my belief in God is justified inferentially. So, and I would say I'm open, but I'm skeptical of reformed epistemology.
Right, and I guess that's a good position to take. You're probably a little more open than I am, because even just in regard, if we were going to go with a pushback about some moral beliefs that are just into it, I'm just not sure that I would even buy into that. Again, I might try to argue that they're even as shallow or as unrefined as they may be, I would still want to point to some sort of reason, even in those types of moral beliefs that we may have. But of course, that's a whole nother, a whole nother lecture, a whole nother course, most likely. Now, since the initial recording was cut off, and I'm going to go ahead and go back and add a few of those things, I still want to go ahead and say this at the end of the course here, just in the case that something doesn't happen. You guys, you that are in the course right now, you're listening and are contemporary Christian philosophers of significance. I just want to go ahead and reiterate, just in case something happens, that we've had the privilege and we've had the pleasure of listening to Professor Hsaio, Timothy Hsaio, currently at Grantham University. He did his BA and his MA in philosophy at Florida State. He's currently pursuing his PhD under David Oderberg at the University of Reading in the UK. You guys may have heard us reference David Oderberg in regard to metaphysics, essentialism, all these sorts of things. And that is, by the way, that is so awesome that you're getting to do your PhD under Oderberg, man. I can't even believe that. So anyway, he's got that. Also, if you are just dying to get into any more arguments around Thanksgiving, with some close family and friends. Professor Hsaio has put out multiple publications at a mere 26 years old, multiple publications on all sorts of hot button cultural topics. And what, regardless of whichever side of the aisle you stand on in some of those issues, I'm not even going to mention them here. You'll have to go look those up. You can find them pretty easily. But those issues, regardless of wherever you stand on which side of the aisle, they're peer-reviewed, published articles. He's got some good arguments to make for his position. So wherever you stand, you're going to have to actually, roll up your sleeves and interact with his arguments there. Again, I'm telling you guys, at the time of this recording, he may have already cracked some sort of logical problem that breaks theism wide open all over Europe or somewhere. I don't know. But he's only 26 years old. I'm expecting big things. He's already done some things in regard to impact for the kingdom, but I'm expecting big things by the time he's my age, right? Pushing, late 30s. I'm expecting him to do some big stuff by then. So guys, you've been listening to Professor Hsaio. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope this brought some different insights, maybe some different ideas to the table from the other philosophers that we've listened to thus far. Have fun with your assignments this week. And would you like to say anything, Professor, as a way of not introduction but outroduction to the students here?
Well, if you're interested in reading my material, you can go to my website. Basically, it's my first name, last name, timhsaio.org. And basically everything I've written there, peer-reviewed stuff, popular articles, maybe a few drafts, are all available for you to view, read, and digest. And I welcome email correspondence. I'm not always the best at responding to emails, but I'd love to chat with anybody interested in the stuff that I do over email. So I'm always trying to, I don't know your students, but I would always encourage you to be vocal and unapologetic about your faith.
Sure.
It has gotten me into some hot water, but I've really made, and I've heard from people who said that my work has made a very good impact on just Christian teachings, Christian doctrines, Christian ethics. And so I would encourage you all to, keep the faith and don't waver.
All right, awesome. Oh, and let me say this. If you've taken my philosophy of religion course, when I went through the Thomistic argument, if you recall, I made specific reference that the version, the particular outline that I was using was this professor right here.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I essentially went through the 5 proofs for the existence of God, Phaser's deal. Mm-hmm. And then I mentioned his essence, existence, distinction, and I mentioned Geisler's kind of breaking down of logical categories. But for the actual syllogism that we used, and don't worry, I have it noted on the actual PowerPoint. It even says Professor, Timothy Hsaio. This is the guy. So you're getting to meet, if you've had my philosophy of religion course, and this is the guy, the syllogism, which we looked at and said was pathetic. No, I'm just kidding. We said it was a great argument, something to be contended with. This is him. So having said that, let's turn off this recording here. And you guys, I hope you will enjoy the rest of